Greetings, everyone, and welcome. I'm Professor Tamer Çavuşgil. We come to you as we do on most Thursdays from Georgia State University as part of the cyber MSI community with 9 other cybers. We have been sponsoring these webinars, informative webinars on international business topics covering pedagogy, research, business practice, and so on. Since April 2020, we have completed over 70 webinars. Many of you who are familiar with the series know that these webinars are recorded and made available for later viewing. They're available to you both on Georgia State University Cyber website, as well as on GSU-CIBER channel on YouTube. And today we come to you with yet another theme, exporting, some topics related to exporting that we have not really visited in recent conversations, and then 2 very expert speakers who will be enlightening us today. Just a little bit of background. Again, these webinars are recorded, and everybody will receive an email with the link after the event. And there will be a short survey when you exit the webinar at the end of 1 hour. There will be a short survey, short questionnaire with 5 questions. We appreciate if you respond to those. And everyone except the panelists is muted in the webinar. So if you have a comment or question, you'd like to join the conversation, and please do, we encourage you to do that. Please use the Q&A function. So there will be a few slides available. I think our speakers will be using today. We'll make those available to you as well after the webinar as part of that email that you will be receiving. So as I promised, today we'll be revisiting the topic of export strategy, obviously a very important phenomenon, both at the macro level as an international business phenomenon, importance of industries and nations, as well as to individual firms. So we're going to be discussing the importance of exports, both as a firm activity as well as a national trend, global shifts, recent disruptions that impact export activity, as well as touch on some future research topics. And we have 2 expert speakers with us today who made their time available. I want to welcome, first of all, Professor Ayşegül Özsomer Tunalı from
Hello,
Koç
everyone.
University. Welcome, Ayşegül. And it's an afternoon for you, so good afternoon to you. And again, thank you for making time available for this conversation. And of course, we welcome back, actually, Professor Sami Said, who's been in previous webinars with us. Said comes to us from the University of Tulsa, where he has been researching international marketing, international business topics for many years. I don't have to say much about his background. I think most of you know him as an accomplished scholar, editor, affiliated with major journals, Journal of International Business Studies to begin with, and others as well. So welcome, Said. And Ayşegül, you are, of course, at Koç University in Istanbul, a full professor, and you published in many journals, but including Journal of Marketing Research, Journal of International Marketing. And Ayşegül, I have admired your work in recent years on global branding. Very good work for which you've received a lot of awards from the American Marketing Association and elsewhere as well. And this year you co-authored a new book on emerging market multinationals that I look forward to seeing also. But let's get going, and maybe I can start with a general question. I mean, the nature and domain of exporting, how important it is for small companies, large companies, as well as the nations as a whole. Maybe Saeed, you can start with that broad question.
Thank you very much, Tamer, and thank you for that introduction. I'm pleased to be able to share some thoughts with you and sort of revive this topic. As a starter, this is an important activity for international business. The total value of world trade is around $22 trillion. So it's a huge sum. And just to put that in perspective, several countries are very active in this. China, of course, is by far the largest exporter, about $3.4 trillion of exports. And the US, of course, is always a large player, but dwarfed by China in terms of just exporting at about 1.8 trillion. And again, just to put things in perspective in terms of large trading partners, European Union, all of European Union countries combined is about $6.6 trillion, but 2/3 of that is internal. But from an exporting perspective, all of that counts because it's outside their national borders. Germany is a special case, and that's 1.6 trillion, just a bit under the US volume. But both in the case of the US and really all advanced countries, but particularly the US and Germany, we can't talk about exports without really discussing the foreign direct investment position of both nations, because oftentimes what happens when companies advance, they transition more to direct investment and local production or global rationalized production to supply the world. So exporting will continue to play a big role as they engage in FDI, particularly on a global scale. Just to put things in perspective, 2 auto manufacturers from Germany, one Daimler-Benz and another one BMW, in Alabama and South Carolina, respectively, they produce in the US largely SUV and crossover vehicles. And in both cases, they export from the United States about 60% of their production. In the case of BMW, those cars go to about 120 different countries. So we need to take the global scale into account and understand what's happening in the total picture when we talk about exporting specifically. Again, to bring this to a different angle, intra-firm trade. This is trade between subsidiaries of multinational companies, but within multinational companies themselves. In other words, subsidiaries of a company in one unit. And that is about 1/3 or just roughly over 1/3 of world trade, about 34%. Another 33% is inter-firm MNCs. So these are trades between different MNCs, which again occupies a huge sum of export trade. And I think this is an area that more research would be desirable in terms of how companies rationalize global production and how do they price across subsidiaries, what are the margins and the decision-making process like for exporting to both inter and intra-firm. And I think this is an area that has not received sufficient attention in the literature, certainly as of late. US exporters, of course, are large, but oftentimes we see larger companies engaging in exporting. 72% of US exports tend to be by larger firms, and these are defined by OECD as firms over 250 employees. And I realize that's not really the typical definition we use for large firms, but that's OECD's definition that I'm sharing with you. I just want to make sure that definition is understood. But that's about 72%. So altogether, we see about 2/3 of exporting activity is among larger firms, and so that really deserves a close attention. In the US, about 5.5 million firms, about 4 to 8% of these 5.5 million firms are engaging in exporting. That's an economist's estimate. The top 10% of exporters, of these exporters, manage about 96% of US exports. So again, we see that larger firms are very active in the United States. The profile is such that when we compare Germany with the US, we see more activities on the side of smaller firms. So it's not quite as top heavy as is the case in the United States. So in the US, we have a lot of room for growing exports on the side of smaller and medium-sized firms. And that certainly is not new. It's something that's been going on for a long time. And there are lots of benefits, as everyone knows, about in exporting. Exporting firms tend to be more productive. They grow faster. They hire more skilled workers, and they pay higher wages, and they tend to be more technology and capital intensive, and of course very active on R&D fronts. So all of those are really positive byproducts of engaging in exporting.
Thank you. Thank you, Said. That gives us a good reminder, good overview of the importance of exporting as a major national trend activity, as well as firm activity as well. Ayşegül, to say that we live in interesting times would be an understatement, because recent history with all of these disruptions, technological, political, healthcare, and so on, we've seen the landscape of business change so much, and firms had to react and adapt themselves to these disruptions. So how these recent disruptions in the global economy affected goods and services exporting at the macro level?
Thank you, Hocam. Thank you, Tamer, for a wonderful introduction and inviting me to be part of this webinar.
Yes.
And Said started very nicely with explaining the importance of exporting. And let me add one thing to that. The conversation about supply chains also means that supply chain ecosystems actually are composed of exporting and importing. So whenever we are talking about sourcing, whenever we are sourcing about supply chain disruptions, we are really talking about disruptions to exporting from one side and importing from the other. So in fact, we may not be using the name exporting, but exporting is really part of the whole supply chain as well. So just bringing it, the conversation from where Said left to the current times, particularly focusing on 2020, I want to share a few slides and see where we are. Okay, so basically, how did exports perform when we look at the landscape? Really, as Tamer, you alluded already, I mean, we have never seen any events like this probably in the last decades, some of which we can call black swan events, which really come out of the blue, like the COVID pandemic, and disrupted the environment. And in fact, it's a very curious case that the Brexit, which took effect February 1st, 2020, and the first COVID cases in Europe were seen January 31st, 2020. So in fact, the two major events, at least for Europe, took place simultaneously. Then, of course, we have the ongoing and accelerating climate crisis. In terms of supply chain disruptions, we had the Suez Canal obstruction, which already was a big backlog to the dysfunctioning supply system. And finally, in February 2022, the start of the Russia-Ukraine war created additional volatility and difficulty of access, for example, to wheat, as Ukraine and Russia are one of the largest exporters of wheat for the world. However, exports seem to bounce back. They seem to be very resilient because they are part of trade, and we can't live without them. For example, just looking at 2019 and 2020, this is exports of goods in $1 billion based on OECD figures. We see how export took a dip with COVID and Brexit. However, in 2021, there is a rebound. In fact, for OECD countries, the rebound is even higher and probably explained by pent-up demand. EU also recovered quite quickly, and also USA recovered in 2021. So after the crisis, exports of goods seems to bounce back. What about exports of services? We see a similar picture for for the EU. Services exports, so these would be like consulting services, software services, cloud services, etc. They bounced back for Europe, and Europe came back even a little stronger in terms of volume, but OECD did not fully recover and US did not fully recover. But despite the situation of US and OECD, at least for goods markets, we can say that exports recover quite fast. Of course, given the COVID pandemic, I call the COVID pandemic the accelerator of digitalization, because companies that were going to take things slowly had no choice but to quickly switch to digital exporting, doing some functions digitally. And we are all now familiar with big digital, both B2C as well as C2C markets emerging and taking more part of overall exports. With this, against this background, maybe we can talk a little bit about the case of Ford Otosan, a partnership with Ford Motor Company in Turkey. Ford Otosan is a 50-50 joint venture between the Koç Group, the largest conglomerate in Turkey, of which Koç University is funded, and the Ford Motor Company. And as we all know, the COVID pandemic caused automotive production to halt for 5 to 7 weeks. In fact, automotive production never halts. These factories normally do not stop, but it stopped for the first time. And a conversation, an interview with the CEO revealed 3 major concerns for them. One was, of course, how to protect human life. The other one, how to secure parts and components from all around the world. For example, semiconductors were coming from China, and the pandemic started in Wuhan, China, so they didn't have access to that. And then how to move finished goods to consumption countries, which is mostly Europe. And finally, how to handle a market that collapsed first. Demand in automotives with the onset of the pandemic decreased 95%, but then very quickly recovered to the extent where, you know, they were shocked they didn't have enough cars produced. So this would be really characterized as a VUCA environment: volatility, uncertainty, high competition, and ambiguity. So a very challenging time indeed for decision makers.
Excellent. Thank you, Ayşegül. That gives us a lot of good background on, and the examples you have given also very interesting. Maybe since you started this discussion focusing on individual company experiences, maybe we can highlight 1 or 2 companies and how they've managed to survive and stay agile and perhaps resilient in this very disruptive environment, the VUCA environment that you call. Maybe Ayşegül, you can start, maybe, and then Said next.
Okay.
Or both, doesn't matter.
Yeah, but let me sort of dovetail into Ayşe's comment about the Turkish joint venture. And sort of, I'm going to go back and look at the VUCA environment. And I think every time I think of disruptions, the thought that comes to mind, and I know Tamer and maybe Aisha would recall that in 2011, the AIB conference was held in Nagoya. And just months before that, Japan had experienced the Tohoku tsunami, which caused the Fukushima nuclear power disaster. What's unfortunate about it, and what makes it a very good, but sort of regional example of how this regional disruption causes worldwide supply chain issues, is that a lot of auto part manufacturers, particularly for Nissan and for Toyota, were located in that region, and both companies were severely impacted by inaccessible supply sources and factories that were essentially, in some cases, destroyed. And so that really put them in a very difficult position for an extended period of time. And that, of course, reflects back on something that they hadn't at the time built in, was resilience, because they relied on sole sourcing for their parts and just-in-time delivery, which are two things that you really cannot do without when you're going for greater efficiency. But then, of course, disruptions like this causes you to pause and rethink exactly what's better for the company in the long term. But it's not just them. A whole bunch of other companies, some unrelated to auto manufacturing, were also impacted. Shin-Etsu Chemicals is the largest supplier of wafers for chips, and their company was damaged, and they were delayed by months, I think, before they could deliver any wafers to chip manufacturers around the world. And microcontrollers produced by Renesas Electronics, they had significant damage to the factory. It was out of commission for a long time. And at the same time, rather unfortunately for them, they had flooding in Thailand that also put another factory out of commission. So they got back to the drawing board and redesigned their microcontrollers for cars so that they would share across platforms and not be, in other words, they standardized essentially most products that they produce, so they could supply from a range of other sources. And even a company like Merck Chemicals, Germany, they are largest producer and their sole supply source for Xyralic, which is metallic pigments that go into metallic paint. They were sourcing it from Fukushima, and their warehouse, which was also located there, was significantly impacted. And they had to go back and redesign their entire supply chain system with redundancy in inventory and sourcing, and including adding a new factory in Germany, just in case that becomes necessary. So I wanted to also share a series of experiences from two countries that are significantly export reliant, and that's Korea and Taiwan. But I want to focus mostly on Korea, and this is a study that we conducted a while ago with colleagues from Taiwan, Korea, and one in the U.S. And we found that in most cases during the pandemic, which sort of dovetails what example that Aisha uses, that manufacturers essentially were stranded. Their supply costs went up as much as 60%. Increased shipping costs that was tremendously expensive, more expensive, simply because it just wasn't available or as available. And functionaries were unavailable, freight forwarders, custom brokers, and all of this costs money to the exporting countries. And longer lead times, because a lot of us went remote. I know at universities, most of us went remote, but that was a relatively easy transition. So just finding people to contact and perform tasks became very difficult, not to mention negotiating contracts and making a sale. as a result, were forced to rely more so on local supplies. They redesigned their supply sources to more of a local supply where they could. They also sharply focused on marketing functions. They did greater segmentation. New product development surprisingly moved up and made higher. They reduced, of course, unnecessary promotions, but shifted those dollars in when possible. And in one case, it was not possible. In two cases of the three companies we studied, it was possible, and they shifted attention online. And these were, of course, more consumer-oriented products like candy and cosmetics that they were able to use social media and influencers and local celebrities. And here's what they did. They used local celebrities. They didn't just use one celebrity worldwide. They just went to individual markets and became creative with their marketing tactics in the export markets. And they essentially redesigned their business models so that they would address the issues. One other thing we noticed is that they moved upscale. They tried to sort of de-emphasize lower margin products and focus on higher margin products for export markets. In fact, in the case of the candy company, they found that consumers, it's a candy and snack company actually, that consumers were actually seeking more healthy alternatives. And so that gave them an entree into developing new products that addressed those desires or those needs of the customer. And we also found that, and a side finding that, again, thanks to our colleague in Korea, and we did further research on this, and there seemed to be indications based on our interviews that some countries, because of their geopolitical situation, are more agile simply because of the threat of neighboring countries, and they are just more responsive to changes. They're quick to change. And I think this helped in both Taiwan and Korea, the companies to redesign their systems and get back on track, so to speak. In 2 out of the 3 cases, exports actually grew faster once they redesigned their system than the domestic market. In other words, the export market for them recovered quicker than the domestic market. Again, speaks to the importance of exporting as a part of the broader business model that companies can use.
It's a related question to this, and we encourage our participants. We have some 100 people who have joined us from around the world today. But yeah, definitely, Saeed, we've seen remarkable reactions by companies to the recent disruptions. So we have seen, for example, a shift from just-in-time supply chain or sourcing to just-in-case sourcing, and much more near-shoring than distant-shoring, offshoring. And we've seen this actually in the case of, and this is the question that this colleague is asking, in the case of semiconductors, chips, right? So all of a sudden we see in the United States major new green plants starting up production, a couple in Arizona, for example, and other places. And individual states are also competing for these big direct investment projects coming from Taiwanese companies or US companies and so on. So there's a lot of lessons here to be learned, both for nations, national industrial policy, as well as individual firm policy. What about some of the other shifts? It's not just the healthcare pandemic issue, of course, Aisha and Saeed, but also exchange rate fluctuations recently, regulations, trade tensions, trade frictions among countries, and so on, that companies have experienced. How have these influenced company action and strategies?
Tamer, if I may, I want to follow up a little bit from Said's point. He mentioned how in his research he found companies increasing innovation in this very volatile environment. In fact, not giving that much importance to pricing, but quality, segmenting better. And in a research we conducted with some colleagues in Greece, we found the same thing during the deep recession that Greece entered after the great financial crisis of 2008, that really emphasizing quality and really focusing on customer satisfaction with very frugal innovations actually resonated in the market. But if I may, let me add a little bit more to exporting as an internationalization strategy in a volatile environment. Given my location in Turkey, I can give some examples from emerging markets. Basically, emerging market firms are in a very difficult situation because of the volatility, not just because of COVID or, but these markets are continuously volatile. And exporting for them is very important for two main reasons. One is the fluctuations in the market and increasing demands make them very fragile if they are only a domestic firm. So the typical what we teach in our courses that exporting is a diversification strategy to diversify market exposure risk is something they use. But another very important weakness is difficulty of accessing hard currency. So emerging market firms, because of the volatility also of exchange rates, have very difficulty in accessing euros or dollars. I just had an interview with a company which apparently they were doing very good in the domestic market. This is in the textile industry. The owners wanted to grow. They needed to import some machinery from Italy for more sophisticated textile manufacturing. However, they didn't have the currency. So they started exporting, getting the currency, buying the machinery. And 20 years later now, this company employs 3,000 employees. They are one of the major sourcing textile sweater sourcers for Zara and Mango globally. And the average order size is 50,000 units to 100,000 units. So, again, just the need to access hard currency. Given the question we had from one of our participants, the situation, I want to talk a little bit about alternative sourcing sites. Now, the fact that the pandemic started in China and the fact that China also closed its borders and factories for a long time cast doubts about China as a reliable sourcing place, at least in the near medium term. So companies are looking for other alternatives. As you said, just in case inventory is becoming important, proximity is becoming important. So maybe not national sourcing if the country doesn't have the capability, but sourcing regionally. For example, European Union is relying more on Spain, Portugal, and Poland and Turkey as a sourcing site. So new alternative manufacturing sites are established, even if the prices are a little higher. So these are, of course, mean new opportunities for exporters from these regions.
Excellent. And a comment for our participants, for some reason, our chat function may not be working because I don't see comments, queries. I think Q&A function is working though. So please send us some messages, post your questions and so on, either using Q&A or the chat function. So one of our participants says the chat is turned off. Yeah, it's beyond our control. Janelle. There seems to be a problem with the Zoom features here, but we appreciate your patience with that. So turning to our conversation again, these are great insights. And one of the major shifts we have seen, of course, in the contemporary business landscape is the emergence of, well, first of all, with the digitalization of the economy, digitalization of business activity, and emergence of digital enterprises. That has added a new dimension to the nature of exporting. So because there are digital enterprises, there are digital trades and transactions as well. That's such a big topic that we will cover more in greater detail, perhaps, with our speakers today in another webinar. But maybe you have some preliminary comments on that. Digitalization of the global economy and how it affects exporting.
Yeah, if I may start on that, and then I'll pass it to Aisha to comment as well. This is, as everyone knows, it's a very critical and important change in the business environment, and I'm looking forward to having a longer dialogue on that topic alone. But clearly, exporting has shifted. The landscape has shifted by virtue of having platforms that companies can join, and these are international platforms like Alibaba and others that sell either intra-industry or across industries, and including consumers that can buy from other countries. And these are all exporting kinds of activities that really didn't exist prior to 1994, 1995. And so this is a huge change in exporting. And of course, along with that, a good bit of research has been undertaken, and I think you should, it does make a huge difference, and we look forward to that discussion later.
Maybe I can add a little bit with some, because Saeed alluded to the research. How have researchers approached it? So I will share just a little bit of knowledge about exporting, but also digital exporting, where companies are deploying e-commerce to reach international markets. And obviously, this is a great opportunity, particularly for SMEs, which otherwise would not be able to reach these markets. But we are also seeing direct-to-customer sales via digital exporting. A company in China can sell directly to customers in Germany or Denmark, or vice versa. So digital exporting probably is going to take off even more in future decades. But just looking at the research, I could identify only one paper published in 2021, which actually uses the digital exporting term and defines it as such. But there are other research, for example, use of internet channel involving a range of activities such as promoting your goods, marketing, after-sales support, enabling firms to access information very quickly, market information, and facilitates effective communication with customers around the world, but also for existing global brands, ability to reach untapped markets, as JB Steenkamp talks about it in his research, and for emerging global brands, potential for becoming global easily with rapid reach, expanding the market reach of their firms. And this may take place regardless of size. So resource-concerned firms may expand abroad very fast. In fact, Tamer Hoca has really looked at this with the born globals. So you can have born globals, digital born globals, and they can take much faster to become global and access foreign markets.
Excellent. Given the time, and we're talking about research, And we have many colleagues who are working in this area. And I'll remind everybody again, Ayşegül, exporting has always been a major activity. And we've done research all along, but in recent years, we have changed the terminology a little bit. We've been using supply chain management, for example, sourcing, etc. And when we talk about those, we are actually talking about export and import activity. But I think colleagues would be interested hearing from both of you as to promising research topics, avenues, as well as research methods, because you are both very active researchers, very well published. It would be good to get your insights on what you see as the agenda for research in the future for our colleagues.
Let me.
You go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, let me share my screen, and I think that includes also one topic that I think Ayşe is going to discuss. But let me just share this screen. So there are a number of topics that requires more attention in context of recent times. You know, the triggering mechanism is one thing that has been studied, of course, extensively in the past. And I think studying it again in light of the big changes in the environment, reconfiguration of MNCs and other firms in terms of supply chains and supply sources. And so this is an idea that I think could be refreshed and updated in terms of just basics of exporting. Again, I don't recall having seen recent studies that address that. The topic has become sort of dormant for some time. Exporting strategies in host markets is evergreen. It's ongoing, and the contributions are being made, but more is needed, particularly in the context of emerging markets. How do emerging market firms configure their strategies in other countries, in other markets, both in terms of advanced countries and less advanced countries? We don't see very many comparative exporting studies. And I think comparative research is obviously more challenging. You're looking at 2 or more countries, and it's difficult to do it in one, let alone 2. But I think that should be encouraged. It gives us a comparative basis for seeing how things stack up against one another, countries and environments against one another. And then in one that has received almost little attention, we did some research in this back in the 90s, currency choice in exporting. Tomer spoke of currency exchange rate fluctuations. And this we found, and again, the topic that should be revisited, that importers, customers like to have the choice of exchange currency what is the transaction currency in an export deal. And this has not been looked into. And we found that companies that offer options to the customer, they actually are performing better and have longer term relationships with customers. And along those lines, another topic that has received limited attention is one of export pricing, particularly at the margin. And it's a known fact that companies manipulate prices for export markets, sometimes at the higher end and sometimes at the lower end to capture new markets. And very little is known on this topic. Let me just give you a glimpse of a study that we did some time ago, and sort of gives us an idea of comparing larger firms with smaller firms. We find that in terms of company size, smaller companies have a greater tendency to charge the same price for export markets. and very few actually go higher or lower. And when they do, the margin difference between domestic and international sales is about 9%. Then on the larger side, we see that the large companies, roughly over a third, maybe 38%, charge about the same price, but an equal number, proportion, charge higher prices and lower prices. And when the prices are higher, is about 10%. When the prices are lower, the margin difference is about 23%. So larger firms appear to be more agile and more flexible and perhaps strategic in capturing or addressing export market needs. And this could definitely be a way to address at least partially the currency exchange issues that were raised a bit earlier. And then market orientation and transaction currency choice as another topic, and exporting as means for developing IB skills. And this is something that we did not specifically address earlier, but there's no question that exporting is the training ground for internationalizing the firm. And this is where we learn all the ins and outs and allows the firm to become familiar with environments in which they will later perhaps establish sales subsidiaries and closer relationships, and that demands more research. To be sure, research has taken place in that area as well, but I think more is needed. And measuring export profitability is another issue. There are a number of studies that have looked at export profitability and export performance, but exporting is not crystallized. Export margins and export prices are not crystallized. I'm not sure that many companies really know precisely what the cost of exports for them is, particularly if they're very small exporters. And if they're investing a great deal or discounting, I'm not sure to what extent this is recorded and managed. And I think it would be really good for a study to take a deep dive into the pricing mysteries that surrounds export pricing, particularly in smaller firms.
Excellent. Ayşegül, do you wish to comment also on some
Yes.
research avenues in exporting?
Yes. I mean, Said provided a quite rich research areas. I could add to that list maybe new business models enabled by digital tools in exporting. Maybe we already see direct to consumer as well as consumer to consumer models, like direct to consumer models like Allbirds selling directly to consumers their shoes around the world, and then consumer to consumer Airbnb. But what about these business models? You know, what differentiates successful ones for not so successful ones? What are some enablers of success and inhibitors of success? I think those are good research questions. And also, I think the importance of brand equity in exporting has not received sufficient attention, given the importance of branding even from no-name small companies via internet channels. Perhaps, you know, some research on that could be fruitful. And if I may add a little bit to how to conduct research, I think would be nice or actually beneficial to forget a little bit everything we know, because given this black swan events and the VUCA environment, I think a clean slate is how we can start, maybe with exploratory research actually, and conducting in-depth interviews with managers, owners, particularly top level CEOs, trying to understand how they process this environment, how they make sense of it, what kind of mechanisms do they have in place. I think those could provide rich insights. So I would recommend in-depth interviews with multiple levels within the organization. So going back to Said's research, in-depth case studies of a few firms, and then drawing insights from those, but also if possible, of course, it's difficult to collect the data and time consuming, but forming dyadic data where we look at the exporters, and some of you have done great research in that, and looking at the other side of the transaction, and maybe even the network, maybe more than one triadic data, I think would be very valuable.
Excellent. Those are good research topics, Ayşegül. I should have mentioned at the beginning, but we have with us several people from Georgia State Cyber team, and one of those is Dr. Cüneyt Evirgen. Cüneyt, I know you're listening in, and you have done a lot of research on the retail side, internationalization of retailers, especially in digital activity by retailers. Do you have any comments to add to this discussion?
Thank you, Tamaraja. Well, I mean, it's been a great discussion. Thanks, Saeed and Ayşegül. I mean, for enlightening us on the latest developments and with the major disruptions. Yeah, exporting is not is a very significant activity, and it's very true. All supply chains actually are involved in the very process of exporting at the originating or ending end. And one of those developments has been, as far as I could observe closely, was on internationalization of retailing itself. So, I mean, the rise of e-commerce was very apparent in many ways, locally and internationally. But with the disruptions, particularly the COVID disruption, accelerated this significantly, as Ayşegül correctly noted. But that also gave a lot of leeway, as it was underlined by both Ayşegül and Saeed, development of direct-to-consumer sales. Even SMEs that I also have heard and know a couple that have started exporting through their D2C access in the international arena by using e-commerce. Either directly through their own website or using some platforms like Amazon or others. So that very topic, that is the impact of digitalization on exporting or using digital channels for exporting, I think demands a lot of attention. And it's a great area for research, for going deeper, because it's a relatively newer phenomena, where a channel is actually changing the business models and introducing new types of players into the exporting world. Some first-timers, some old-timers that have to change their approaches. So I was very glad to hear that we'll be able to listen to these outstanding speakers once again, when they will specifically go in detail in terms of digital exporting. To hear the latest in that regard, in terms of research, in terms of examples. Some of them are very small, some of them are very big. So I will look forward, and I would highly encourage our participants listening in today to join in that webinar as well, because that will be straight out of the oven. It's very, very hot topic, and it's changing the whole retailing arena and really bringing in new dynamics.
The retail arena is very rich for research as well. We've seen, especially in e-commerce activity by e-groceries businesses. I mean, we've seen companies like Getir from Turkey, originating from Turkey, doing major international expansion in Europe and in the United States as well. So we do need to address that in a future topic. One of our participants, Timo Mander, is reminding us that, speaking of digital exports, IMR is going to have a special issue devoted to that, and he's inviting colleagues to submit papers. So maybe we have just a few minutes left. We can wrap up with some other comments that you want to share, Saeed and Ayşegül, with our participants, especially when it comes to research, conducting research. So we talked about themes, research avenues, but what about research methods and practices, as well as perhaps publication outlets in this area? Saeed?
Well, I think, you know, a good piece of research has home in many top journals. And so it really, the outlets, I don't think in terms of the ones that we aspire to publish in, there are, I don't know that there are many changes in that. There are new publications always coming on board, but the ones we aspire to publish in are the top ones. In addition to I think one of the things that's happened with research methods is in the advent of digitization and archival data, a lot of colleagues have moved to leverage available data and or they do focus group research, as is the case with consumer behavior kind of studies. And I really would like to see a lot more personal interviews and you know, firm-based data collection, which is more challenging, more difficult. And but to get the finer grain information, I think that that visit to the company as a pre-study or as the whole study, as I think Aisha also alluded to, that is really gives you the insights that you cannot get from archival data and from masses of data. So that's in terms of the methods, I think I would encourage more of that type of research as opposed to depending on increasingly on archival data and server-based data, which has its own room and its own application. But particularly as it relates to exporting, we need more insights from companies.
One of our participants, Mario Gonzalez, is talking about qualitative methods as an opportunity. Definitely a lot more work should be done in that. And when we do these qualitative interview-based data collection, obviously you gain one major strength, ability to look at the evolution of exporting in an individual firm, rather than just a one-time cross-sectional kind of data that you obtain through surveys. So these in-depth studies of individual firms through qualitative methods, interview methods, should be very, very illuminating. Ayşegül, any other comments along these lines?
No, I mean, in terms of research methods, I don't have anything to add. If I may, maybe I can talk a little bit about Rajendra's question and try to provide an answer from our emerging market perspective. You know, with all these disruptions and most recently the Russia-Ukraine war, the globalization, what we see from the side of the world, let me say, being so close to Russia and Ukraine, you know, just south of the Black Sea, we see that some regional groupings are emerging. So you are right that maybe from global scale, you are looking more to around you, neighbors around you. In fact, it's an interesting case. I, again, am very close following a chemicals firm in Turkey. This firm imports chemical semi-finished ingredients for the cosmetics and detergents industry from Europe, Western Europe, and sells it domestically as well as selling it to other countries, particularly high-risk countries like Iraq, Syria, Iran, Lebanon. And they have been able to do that because what they sell is necessary for human hygiene and they can be exported despite embargoes. So those are, being a neighbor, there are some, how shall I say, permissions to help in a way. And now with the situation in Ukraine and Russia, given the embargo in Russia by the Western firms and also the situation in Ukraine, the same firm was exporting to Russia 500,000 euro worth, so $500,000 before the war, and now it's up to 15 million. So again, it's hygiene products, so that it's necessary, and European and American firms do not want their brands to be seen there. So other sources and being close, create some regional opportunities. But of course, the best thing would be peace to come as soon as possible to the region. As we are holding our breaths every day, of course, we are, but some kind of, opportunities for SMEs in terms of accessing markets that previously they may not be able to are also emerging.
It's a very good point, Ayşegül. I'm glad you mentioned that, because somehow firms find a way, even in the most difficult, dire circumstances, they find opportunities. And this relates to Trevor, our colleague, Trevor Williams from Global Atlanta. His comment about the raising interest rates by the Fed, by the central bank, of course, created difficulty for U.S. firms. It means that the dollar strengthens, and with high value dollar vis-a-vis other currencies, U.S. exports are at a disadvantage. But then this may create opportunities for firms from abroad, as well as individual firms in the United States who may be in product lines or service lines that are not so price sensitive, right? I mean, so price elasticity comes to the picture. So if you are selling semiconductors, it doesn't matter. The exchange rate doesn't matter. If you're selling, very unique, let's say, digital medical devices, or even aircraft engines, and you are one of the few competitors in the business, it's going to create opportunities for you regardless. But yes, definitely that is a very good question and a good comment. Saeed, you want to say something?
Just really quickly, I think we may be running out of time, but your comment, and of course earlier comments about currency exchange rates, reminds me of Mercedes-Benz in the United States. As those of us who are a little bit older recall that before the euro, Deutsche Mark was 4 to the dollar, going back in the late 60s and early 70s. And I think at its height, I think it was about 2 to the dollar, or actually less than 2 to the dollar. So you can imagine a car that's produced in Germany, like many other products that are produced in Germany, they really couldn't compete with the low-end products from Japan and from Korea and many other markets. So they chose, as a matter of strategy, to strengthen the one thing that would hold their price and market share, and that was upscale and prestige type of positioning. And they became very successful despite the increase in prices. Of course, they would occasionally eat some of that price increase, as I said, in terms of understanding marginal pricing and pricing at the margin. But then they passed along a lot of it to the customer. We always use the Mercedes as an example. It's a luxury car, no matter what it looks like or which model it is in the United States. Everybody that sees the logo, they think it's a low high-end product. But we get off the airport at Frankfurt and come out, and what do we see as taxi cabs? They're all Mercedes, as is the case, of course, in many countries. So, they decided to soup up the bottles and position them accordingly, and that was their way of addressing the currency exchange rate and the currency fluctuation in their cases. So it worked really well. And when you think of it broadly, this applies to a lot of German brands and German products, that they have moved up and repositioned their products from pens to industrial products and to consumer products.
I want to thank Alex as well, who has shared a recent publication with us in a journal that some of us may not follow, Technological Forecasting and Social Change, by our Italian colleagues, certainly Antonella Zuccella and Giovanna Magnani from University of Pavia. So thank you, Alex, for sharing this with our participants. Well, unfortunately, we need to wrap up. I do want to thank our panelists who have joined us today. Ayşegül, thank you for joining us from Koç University in Istanbul. Saeed, thank you for joining us from University of Tulsa. We will certainly pick this topic up again, especially the digital aspects of exporting in future webinars. Again, a reminder for our participants, this session will be available as a recording to you later on in just a couple of days. Look at it from YouTube, Georgia State University Cyber YouTube channel, or Georgia State University Cyber website. And I do want to also remind everyone that after a 2-year hiatus, we are beginning our in-person IB pedagogy workshops that will take place in 2023 in Atlanta again. So we look forward to seeing everybody in person at that annual event. Also sponsored by the Cyber Consortium, Georgia State University Cyber, as well as 9 other cybers in the country. So thank you for your participation, Ayşegül and Saeed. We look forward to seeing you at another seminar, webinar. And thank you everyone who joined us from different time zones and different corners of the world. And have a good rest of your day.